Bom dia para quem é de bom dia, boa tarde para quem é de boa tarde, boa noite para quem é de boa noite, e 93 para quem é de 93. E não, você não está no canal errado. Aqui é mesmo o Projeto Mayhem. Só que eu tomei as chaves do Boteco de assalto e quem manda aqui hoje sou eu. Hoje nós temos um convidado muito legal. Ele é um colorista de HQs e foi ele o responsável por editar e publicar o Green Sheaf, que é a revista da Pamela Colman Smith. Então, a gente está trazendo aqui mais um tema atrelado ao financiamento coletivo da Oficina Palimpsesto. Se você ainda não apoiou, o que você está esperando? A gente está quase batendo 100% da meta, eu estou animadíssima. E se você quer entender, acompanhar a entrevista, mas não fala inglês, é só você vir aqui embaixo no botãozinho de subtitles, e aí você vai clicar em Change to Portuguese, e aí vai ficar subtitulado para você conseguir... Subtitulado não, legendado, para você acompanhar com a gente. E a partir de agora, a gente vai falar em inglês, tá bom? Quer dizer, eu vou introduzir todo mundo, quem quiser se apresentar em português, se apresenta em português, quem quiser se apresentar em inglês, se apresenta em inglês. So, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, people. Today we are receiving an amazing artist, Aladdin, who was responsible for the editing and publishing of Pamela Colman Smith's Green Sheaf magazine. And he also has other amazing works, which we'll talk about to us a little bit. And this is a part of our campaign, actually, Oficina Palimpsestos campaign, crowdfunding campaign of Pamela Colman Smith's complete works, which is unique in the world and you should be a part of. So, but before I introduce you to Aladdin, I would like to introduce the people from Projeto Mayhem. So, Ulisses Massad, boa noite.
Boa noite, Bárbara. Boa noite, pessoal. Hello, Aladdin. Thanks to be here. Hoje vamos ter aí uma entrevista com um assunto bem interessante. Nós já tivemos alguma abordagem do que seria esse material com a Marina, uma outra entrevista. E vamos ver como é que vai ser hoje. Estou aqui curioso para conhecer um pouco mais sobre o assunto.
E hoje também estamos com Vanessa Lonaro. Adoro Vanessa participando do Mayhem.
Olá, pessoal, tudo bem? Mais uma vez, obrigada pelo convite. Tô super feliz de estar aqui. Hello, Aladdin. It's a great pleasure to meet you, and I'm really excited for today.
E da Oficina Palimpsestos, essa mulher maravilhosa, incrível, a responsável por trazer nosso sonho de ter a obra de Pamela publicada, Marina Jordá.
Olá, todo mundo. Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite. Boa noite para todo mundo que está aqui. Queria agradecer mais uma vez por poder estar participando. E o Projeto Mayhem trouxe muita gente muito legal para a minha vida, assim. Então, fico muito grata também por isso. Eu
apresenta
editorial da Palimpsestos, né? E eu que estou encabeçando a campanha da Pamela, que tem aí um pouco mais de 20 dias para terminar.
E está muito perto de 100%, gente, apoia.
Mais de 80% já.
Marina, fala um pouquinho mais para a gente do Aladdin, como que você conheceu ele, como que você chegou nele?
Eu estava pesquisando todo o trabalho da Pamela, né? E o Green Sheaf é uma parte muito importante da vida dela, que eu acho que reúne muitas das questões mais vitais quando a gente vai falar sobre a Pamela, sobre o trabalho dela e sobre o posicionamento político dela também, né? Ela como uma mulher que deu espaço para outras mulheres, e eu acabei chegando no Green Sheaf, porque eu estava procurando todo o material que eu pudesse consumir, né? Então, todos os livros, e eu encontrei a versão do Green Sheaf impressa. E a introdução do Green Sheaf era do Aladdin, e era uma introdução maravilhosa, um texto incrível, assim. E eu fiquei pensando muito sobre aquilo, achei muito legal ter uma pessoa que tivesse unido todo esse trabalho, que é um trabalho espetacular, mas que estava todo perdido por aí. E E eu imaginava que fosse um senhorzinho, assim, né? Tipo, um senhorzinho colecionador que foi atrás, conseguiu encontrar as coisas. E, de repente, eu encontrei esse jovem artista incrível e que tem um senso de humor, gente, vocês vão perceber, eu acho, ao longo desse programa. É um cara muito legal. E eu fui atrás dele para saber se ele tinha interesse em escrever um ensaio para a gente, para entrar em um dos livros, né? A campanha, ela tem 2 livros, um é a biografia da Pamela Colman Smith e o outro é toda a obra dela, tanto escrita quanto artística, né, quanto a obra visual. E eu convidei algumas pessoas entendedoras da Pamela para falar um pouquinho sobre alguns aspectos que eu achava que ainda ficavam faltando na biografia. E o Aladdin foi um deles. Então, eu convidei ele para falar, para escrever um ensaio sobre a relação da Pamela com a comunidade LGBTQIA+. E é isso aí.
She was saying great things about you, Aladdin. Don't worry. Welcome. Thank you very much. And it's a great honor to be this channel for you and your work here in Brazil. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So the first question we ask everybody is how they ended up in occultism somehow. So I don't know how into occultism you are, but here we usually joke about how everybody started in the Catholic Church and somehow we took this weird route into the occult. And what about you? How was your journey? How you ended up here, and how did Pamela enter your life?
Yeah, I had an interesting spiritual experience as a kid, I guess. My mother was a Wiccan, a practicing Wiccan, and had a sister circle. They would do operations and things, and that was just normal to me. She ended up becoming a teacher at a Waldorf school. I don't know if you're familiar. They're a global institution.
Yeah.
It comes out of theosophy, anthroposophy are the spiritual movements that are part of that. So she was a teacher there. I was a student there when I was a younger person. And again, all of that was just normal. I didn't think of it as a cult, but it all kind of was. And as a teenager, became interested in fantasy fiction, illustrating fantasy designs. And I kind of looked back to my past for a lot of that and became really interested in how different those spiritual movements were compared to what was really going on at Waldorf. They don't explicitly tell the students about anthroposophy. And so learning what the concepts were, sort of symbolic ideas behind what we were doing was really interesting. And I've had an interest in it ever since.
That's amazing. Very unusual. And where about today? How did Pamela enter your life? How did you find out about her? Do you have a tarot deck in your house? How was that?
Yeah, my introduction to Pamela, I was aware of her for a long time. Tarot cards were in the house. So the images had been familiar to me for a long time. And it was around 2012 that I started working in publishing revival literature, where I came across those images again and became more interested in the meaning. I was focused on, at the time, the work of horror author H.P. Lovecraft, who based characters on Arthur Edward Waite. Following that track to Pamela Colman Smith, I found that she had a much stronger creative energy than Arthur Edward. Like, I was like, what is Arthur Edward Waite's magic about? And I read a lot of his history work and his ideas about the Golden Dawn and things. But when I was looking at Pamela Colman Smith's work, it really resonated with me. and coming to understand how much of that deck she created, my appreciation for her kept growing. I also spent time, I had friends at Pratt when I was in college, and I would spend time there, and finding out that Pamela Coleman Smith was a student there was just another thread there that I thought was interesting and kept following. So I've done, as a colorist, I've done some colorings of tarot cards, her line artwork, recoloring them, and incorporating some of her ideas into different writing projects I've had, and visual arts projects as well.
So talking about this, can you explain to the people who don't know, I don't know very well, what is this job, coloring? Why is it separated from drawing? Why is there a specific professional? And maybe you can also talk about the importance of colors, because as a tarot reader, I'm a professional tarot reader, so I know how impactful colors are on a deck. And why is it so special? What is behind it?
So as a colorist, most of my professional work is in comics and graphic novels. And the skills to be an illustrator for comics and graphic novels are very demanding. You need to understand anatomy and storytelling, how to capture the feeling of movement in a still image, and depending on what you're working on, action, machinery, all of these different technical skills that go into illustration that aren't related to color. Color is a separate thing, and plenty of comics that I love are printed in black and white, and that's, I think a great way to appreciate them. But as a colorist, I joke that my main job is making up for the illustrators' blown deadlines, because they tend to take a very long time to finish their work, and I'm very quick. If my process is entirely digital, I can color a page in about an hour if I'm being asked to work quickly. So I like to take my time with them, but yeah, color in comics is part of the storytelling. I try and take into account the tone and the feeling of what the page is trying to evoke, and then play to that. Sometimes I get directions from the script or the writer about how they want it to look, but usually color is just left up to my interpretation. And so in Pamela's case, her early work, I was talking before we started recording about how I thought she would have been a great graphic novelist. Her early work was often criticized for being not competent with the line art, but being an excellent colorist, which I thought it was interesting. They were distinguishing back in 1900, 1901, that was something people were looking at and recognizing. And Pamela Smith is an incredibly competent illustrator. I love her work. It's incredibly resonant, but it didn't look like the style of the time. And so there was this pushback against it. Whereas with her coloring, it was mostly done by hand. And in London, especially, there was a reverence for work that was handmade, handcrafted, and not industrially manufactured. And so she was widely praised for the colors early on, before her style became more recognized and developed into the sort of more mythic symbolism of her tarot work, and also her, I haven't seen too much of it. I love the stuff that I've seen, her work illustrating music pictures, which was, she would receive images while listening to the music and transpose those to the page. And I know that color was a big part of her process and something she thought about a lot.
And I particularly love her colors.
And her colors are excellent, yes.
Yeah.
She knows how to really evoke tone, like I was talking about in my own work. Creating a feeling, her images have a complete feeling in their design, their composition, the line work, and then this finishing touch of, once it's put together, going over. And because it's done by hand, each copy, and I've only seen one complete copy of the Green Sheaf. I would love to see more copies, because each one has different strokes and potentially different color designs. I'm really curious, because if I, as a colorist, if I had to color the same page 100 times like she did, or she and her group of artists, I would start changing the colors eventually because I would get bored. And I'm curious if she had the determination to stick to the color schemes, or if she plays with that feeling of color throughout, which as more copies of the Green Sheaf see the light of day, I guess we'll have that question better answered.
That's very interesting. Well, we have a friend here who is a big fan of comics, but he couldn't make it today. His name is Paulo, so he sent some questions. I'll ask some of his questions. Okay. And one of them was about your own process. So you said that most of the colors is your own interpretation. You're free to interpret and color them as you please. But how is your process? Do you usually interact with the illustrators and writers, or do you keep it to yourself so it doesn't interfere in your creativity? How is it for you?
For most projects, what I want is as much information from the artists and writers as possible to get an idea of what they want this thing to be, and then I can bring my own artistry to that. Mostly people don't engage with color, and every now and then I will have an editor or an illustrator who I'll just have differences in taste and opinion, and so they'll ask for something, I'll give them something, and we'll kind of go back and forth on what the right color scheme is. But that's pretty rare. For the most part, my work tends to be well appreciated the first time around.
And what would you say are your biggest influences?
I read a lot of comics from the late 80s, early 90s. There was a period where Marvel and DC, the two major superhero publishing companies, both launched fantasy lines where they were comic books for mature readers, is the tagline, adults. And they would often be fully painted or have experimental art and design. And so honestly, periodicals not that different from the Green Sheaf. There was one called Epic Illustrated that I love a lot, that featured sort of the best up and coming talents that didn't fit in mainstream comic books, the people that weren't drawing muscles and capes and things like that. I want to give some specific names. As a comic book colorist, I worked for almost 10 years with Jose Villarrubia. He's been a colorist in the industry for many years. He is a professor here at the Maryland Institute College of Art, so we are local to one another. And he is one of the guys that helped pioneer digital comic book coloring back in the 90s. He was a photographer and a watercolor artist who was doing some early work with multimedia in mainstream comics. So I think he was one of the first colorists that got permission at Marvel to do Fantastic Four in watercolors, which it was just a completely different look than anyone had seen before. They won up a bunch of awards, and it just went to show that you can take non-traditional approaches in comic books and there will be a market for them because people want all kinds of things, not just one kind of product.
So talking about this, you and other colorists, when we think about comics, we remember the most famous people like Alan Moore, for example, but we often forget about even the illustrator and the colorists. So how do you feel about this, about not having the recognition that you deserve, or not having your part of the job as recognized as the other steps of the job? How do you see that happening? And maybe this is one of the reasons you connect with Pamela a lot. I don't know. Can you talk about it?
Sure, we can talk about it. You are right that the colorist and the So in my world, the illustrators do get a lot of credit, but for example, someone who does the pencils will get more credit than the person that does the inks. It's often a big process. And oftentimes there will be fill-in artists that make up the lost time. So in the broader culture, it doesn't bother me that people don't think about the colorist, because in a sense, my job when I am working on these books is to disappear. You're not supposed to think about the color when you're reading them. It is supposed to enhance the experience. I do get a little bit salty when the publishers that I work for don't credit me, which is an experience that I had a lot of working in mainstream comics, where there have been dozens of like advertisements or articles printed in magazines like the Rolling Stone and other big periodicals where they'll publish my work and they don't credit my name. And that's coming, the publisher either fails to include it, or I've been told in the past, one publisher really liked my work and they didn't want me to get poached. And so they were intentionally withholding my name in the press so that no one would think, oh, I should hire this person out from under. I was working very cheap at the time. And that was I'm glad he told me. He was a little bit drunk at his own birthday party and he told me that. It's like, okay, well, don't work for that guy anymore. There were a lot of great jobs that came through that contact, but the actual conditions, the feeling of disrespect, it only feels disrespectful if it's someone that I've worked for specifically that knows what I did versus, the readership at large. I'm very comfortable having worked on large projects without necessarily being one of the major recognized creative forces behind them.
Right. That's an interesting point. I think thinking of a tarot deck, for example, that's a little different because like the art and the color is the most important. And then in Pamela's case, it's the opposite. She was the most important part of the process, and because of her art, the tarot deck we call Smithwaite is the most famous deck in the world. And
Absolutely.
even though this is true, she hasn't been recognized until like whatever 20 years ago, 10 years ago. That's insane.
In the past 10 years that she's been a specific interest of mine, I'll do a Google search for her, a deep dive every couple of years. And that was when I first found the Green Sheaf. I had seen no press about it. I'd never heard that copies had surfaced, but a few months after they'd been released on archive.org, it turned up in one of my searches, and I'd heard of it and I saw the first issue. It's like, wow, I wish the rest of this was available, and then found all of it. And just from that moment, I knew like this needed to be circulated, to be more people needed to see it. There would be a large demand for it if people knew about it, because it's another thing working on the book and researching the book, because I found a lot of really bad scholarship on the Green Sheaf because it's written about by people that have never seen it. And so there's people that were credited as working on it that never worked on it. A lot of people that I've seen a lot of confusion about how many issues it ran for, how many pages there were, and just little details, it got lost in translation somewhere. But yeah, there were a few excellent pieces of scholarship on it, and then everything else is a little bit questionable because it's coming secondhand, third hand from different sources.
So can we go there and talk a little bit about the technicalities that you mentioned? So where were they? Like, how were they kept away for so long? Where were they? How did they surface? And how many numbers are there? Like some data.
Yeah, so there's, I now know that there are a lot of complete collections that are kept at different libraries. And I forget which one it was that was digitizing their archives. And archive.org is a place, I do a lot of research there because they have books from, I mean, everything that's in the public domain, it is open to being uploaded there. And a lot of libraries and institutions have taken to uploading their full catalogs there. And so you can not only search titles and authors, but you can search for within the text of those books that has been digitized. And so that was how I did a lot of research for the Green Sheaf, was pulling out names and searching for them in these large volumes of, you know, it's not just books, they have magazines, other periodicals, anything that is of loose historical significance will end up there. And a lot of it's kind of junk or things that are repeated over and over again. So you have to search through a lot of things. And it took me multiple searches for some of these creators because they're working under pen names, or they gave initials and not full names, or they have very common names, which happened a few times, where there are a bunch of people in history that have this name, a few people living at this time, and then narrowing it down to, oh, this person was good friends with Lady Gregory, produced a play at the same time Green Sheaf was happening. This is probably that person. So it's a journey.
It was kind of a treasure hunt.
Yes, which I really enjoy. And I've done similar projects. I mentioned H.P. Lovecraft earlier. He wrote an essay, which is the first time I did this, called Supernatural Horror in Literature. It's about 30 pages long, and it covers the history of supernatural horror in literature up to the time he was writing, which I think the essay was 1928. So virtually every name is in the public domain and on archive.org, either their complete works or the books he's talking about, or at least short stories and different things. So that's kind of how I got the first, that was my first big research project where I was interested in learning everything that I could about the contents. And I have taken that approach to the Green Sheaf, and it's been more rewarding in that it's been studied far less. Like, I wasn't the first person to do footnotes for supernatural horror in literature. That scholarship has been done. Green Sheaf scholarship is very limited, and there has been some great Pamela Coleman Smith scholarship, but her contributors, a lot of them still don't have Wikipedia pages or commonly accessible information. You have to dig for it. And so re-releasing the book and now having worked on this essay, I'm excited to bring some of those names back to the surface and make it easier to find them and pick them out. And there's a lot of poets that are virtually unknown, and their work is excellent. Like, they were kind of dismissed in their own time as part of this visionary vogue of sort of different kinds of supernatural, symbolist, magical writing. And in the mainstream, a lot of that got dismissed. And so it got forgotten, especially the female writers. There's a number of them in here that I'd never heard of that have some great work that's worth checking out beyond the Green Sheaf itself.
Amazing. So how was this process of getting to know the people from Oficina Palimpsestos and knowing about this crowdfunding project, being invited to contribute? How do you feel about it? How do you feel about the project?
Delighted to be invited. I think it's a really special project. I had originally done my work on the Green Sheaf back in 2020, and I made a few small gestures of marketing or getting it out there, letting people know it was available, and then kind of moved on to other things. And having people that care about Pamela Coleman Smith find it. There it is. Having people that care about Pamela Coleman Smith find it is the most important audience for me for the Greensmith, because it is very much a work from her personally. It is her major symbolist outpouring before the tarot deck, and she is the editor and publisher of the book. She has complete creative control. And so the choices that she made, even when it's not her art and writing, still come from her vision and curation in some respects. And the encouragement and excitement about Pamela Coleman Smith and the Green Sheaf has gotten me re-excited about jumping back into it and spending more time. And I'm glad that I had a couple years to digest between first putting it out and coming back, because there are about 30 contributors in her circle, and then there's about 10 or 12 classical authors and writers and artists that have work published in it. And it's a lot of names. And I tried to figure out who each one of those people were. There's a couple anonymous writers I weren't able to identify. And otherwise, I have a pretty complete knowledge of this thing right now. So I want to write it down before I forget all of the details and fragments. I got to put my notes in. I have a very long page of notes that spans several years now.
And how important is Pamela? Like, why is she such a symbol for this new society we are trying to build, where female artists and writers are recognized, where LGBTQA+ people have their own space and are respected as well, where, you know, all kinds of civil rights are guaranteed. So I think she's this powerful symbol, and that's why she's surfacing as this strong figure nowadays, and everybody loves her. Why is she such a symbol for 2022?
I think there's a lot of answers to that question. The brief answers I will give is that when she was producing her big creative output was at the turn of the century, and there were a lot of ideas about what the world could look like at that time. She and her fellow visionaries, progressives, symbolists were looking to build a new world, and they were sowing the seeds of this in a new form of spirituality. And they talk about, a lot of her contributors have spoken at great lengths about this. They're members of the Golden Dawn and the Theosophical Society. And so as they were grappling with a new reality of understanding that space was much larger than they had ever comprehended, time went further back than anyone had ever suspected, they had to reformulate a new idea of spirituality. And that progress was interrupted by 2 world wars. I mean, many things interrupted it, but those 2 major events really shook the group that was forming at the turn of the century, kind of broke apart. And Pamela Smith, especially after World War I, stepped away from a lot of the spiritual socialite work she was doing and concentrated more on her own personal development. And then I also want to address, we haven't talked about it yet, the queerness, LGBT network. So a lot of people have spoken to how Pamela Coleman Smith was a feminist, and she was involved with women's suffrage and helped to build business networks of female writers, artists, and craftsmen. She was also building for herself what I call an affinity network. The Green Sheaf is composed of many openly queer people, and then we can only guess at the other folks that weren't out of the closet, weren't able to talk about their identity and sexuality. In 1895, the indecency trial of Oscar Wilde happened, and it was devastating to the artistic bohemian community. He was a big part of the social world of London, and you didn't have to be queer or part of the queer community to appreciate him as a major figure. And watching him be imprisoned, and I think he passed away at the end of 1899, set a tone for an urgency in the arts to activate networks, secret networks, where they could support one another and at the same time fight for the cause of gay rights. So one of the contributors, George Ives, founded an organization called the Order of the Chironeia, I believe it's pronounced. And that was a secret society for gay men and women to support one another with an emphasis on love, protection, and upholding one another. He was very explicit that it was not a place for dating. This is not a, he's kept it very professional. So he was a contributor. One of the, and this is the queer elements of the book was something I didn't catch the first time around, or I saw gestures of it, and I knew Pamela Coleman Smith had her own queer identity that doesn't get discussed very much, but was a big part of her life. But as I went through, I learned about George Ives, the Order of the Chironeia, also the contributor Christopher St. John. He was born a woman, but he always wrote and performed under a male pen name and seems to have mostly lived as a male. And one of his dreams is recorded in the Sheaf, and he dreams as a male. And he was in a polyamorous relationship with Edith Craig, who was one of Pamela Coleman Smith's friends. And so that was an interesting, I'm using he, him pronouns. It's not done in his biographies or his Wikipedia page because he's referred to by the name that he was born with, which is Christabel, I think. So I tried to respect that in the essay and just appreciate in a world of a very different culture how Christopher St. John might want to be thought of and addressed. And there are some, I'm forgetting the names, but there's other contributors that were queer and were at least open about it after the period of the Golden Sheaf. And then there's a number of poets and illustrators that are working in an interesting, they write about passion, desire, love, longing. They don't use pronouns. And Pamela Coleman Smith and Cecil French's artwork tends to look very androgynous in its figures. And so a lot of the art and literature, you can decide what gender it is as you're reading it. A love poem can be from you to a person of whatever gender you want as you're reading it, or vice versa. And it's not broken up by strict considerations of gender or sexuality, explicit ones. And in that way, working through symbolism, they weren't breaking any indecency laws, or, there was nothing that the state, the empire could do to curtail their support and passion for LGBT arts.
And talking about LGBT, why do you think it's so hard for people to talk about Pamela's sexuality when we have such clear signs that she was at least bisexual? Why is it so difficult for people to talk about the fact that one of the biggest female artists of the 20th century was LGBT?
So where I come from, the little bit of culture that I get to inhabit, that's like a number one selling point. That's the first thing I mention to people that don't know about her. But to answer the question, I think it's because she herself didn't put it into words that I've ever seen. And so in my essay, I try to let everyone speak for themselves to the fullest extent possible, drawing as many quotations and exact, as close to the source material as I can. And anything that is left open and vague, people will run with one way or another. So it is very clear to me that she was a queer woman, and I like to talk about her work in terms of that. And it's more important to a lot of the people that I know because they have something they can connect to and certain feelings that are reflected in her work that they might not see in broader mainstream culture. But there's a lot of people that are scared of discussing sexuality at all. And there's a lot of people that are scared of female sexuality specifically. I've encountered them in the past. And so those two things mixed with some element of sort of the Victorian sensibility of not saying too much, from Pamela's time, all kind of converges to the point where, because it wasn't discussed in history too much and so much of her life lapsed, that taking up the conversation now to some people might feel presumptuous, to other people might feel threatening, and then to the rest of us is just a normal part of the conversation.
Precisely. And then as an artist, and as this researcher, treasure hunter you are, how important is memory? Like how important it is for people like us, feminists, LGBT, Black people, all kinds of people who have never been rightfully represented. How important it is for this memory to be saved, to be rescued from getting lost in history, and how important it is for us as the people who are living nowadays to speak about it, to be open about it, to fight for it.
So it's my belief that we create most of our understanding of the world through stories, whether it's history or the stories we read that have meaning to us. And so as a white man, white boy growing up in the United States, I had tons of stories that were about people just like me. And it was the most normal thing. And I didn't really think about how I was always given heroes and characters that I could look up to with very little, I didn't have to think too hard to connect to them. And as a storyteller, as someone who studied writing for many years and enjoys telling all kinds of different stories, I began to realize the value of how those stories reflected my own identity and how important it was for other people to have those kinds of stories for themselves. And so that was a difficult part of, I mentioned, working with H.P. Lovecraft early on. He was really racist, and it's really hard for people, in addition to many other problems that he had, it's hard for people that know that to want to connect to his work. And so I had already connected to it because it came from New England and ideas that I was very familiar with and comfortable with. And so when I started republishing some of his work and other Lovecraft-oriented work, I specifically sought out female writers and writers of color to bring their own ideas into it, to try and keep it out of just being a product for people that look like me. And it wasn't super successful in that way because it still was mostly a product for people that looked just like me. I was just including other people in it. And in the past year, I started working as a teacher in the Baltimore City schools, where my students are 99% Black and live in mostly very poor neighborhoods. And so what I do with them is a media production class where I teach them to use cameras and to tell stories. And one of the big focuses of that job, one of the things that attracted me to it, was knowing that they weren't having many opportunities to tell their own stories, and that there's limited material available for them to connect to in the first place. It's changing a lot now. There's diversity in storytelling, movies, films, arts, video games. It's all increasing, and it's great. There's a concerted effort, and at the same time, there's a huge pushback against it from the conservative movement. When I was working in superhero comics, there was a movement that came up called Comicsgate, where they attacked mainstream DC and Marvel comic books that had female writers, queer writers, and Black writers. And so I worked on Black Panther, which was written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a phenomenal writer, also Baltimore-based. And there was a huge attack on his credibility to be a comic book writer. That book was ultimately more successful for it because it brought a bunch of fame. But then a book like America was one. It was the first Marvel comic that was written by a queer woman of color, featuring a queer woman of color as the main superhero. And it was viciously attacked online, and it was canceled after just a few issues. And it felt like not only does the culture at large have this animosity towards these important kinds of works, but that they weren't getting support from mainstream corporate interests. They didn't, they canceled the series before the story was finished. And that kind of thing, it just didn't need to happen. They could have taken a very small loss on publishing to collect it and make their money back, but they just canceled it outright. And it felt like they were speaking to that conservative movement saying, we hear you. And there were other books that got canceled as well along those same lines. So yeah, it's really important to not only have this diversity, but to defend it when you have to. It's really unfortunate that it's part of the job that comes along with being a creator that cares about stuff like this, even loosely.
Yeah, and also I believe a lot of people don't see how everything is political, and then they will just treat comics as this out of the world thing where politics don't happen, where actually it's quite the opposite.
Yeah.
As a medium, in a medium that's so popular with young people, it's actually quite political and quite powerful in transmitting not only the civil rights ideas or conservative ideas or whatever, but religious ideas too. So when comics are inspired in occultism, for example, it's also political because it's bringing things which are quite hidden to a major audience. Yeah. So what do you have to say to people about this, to people who can't see the politics and how ideological comics are, and all art actually?
So to be nice to those people, I think that comic books have their own kind of magic where they kind of cast a spell and you take what you want out of them. And so there are people that are going to read comic books that are very political, that are able to engage with it and not feel that at all. And they walk away, and because they didn't feel anything political, surely it wasn't there. Those people are, fools. Going back to the 1940s when superhero comics first started coming out, Superman was always an allegory for the story of Moses, created by two Jewish creators. Captain America was punching Hitler on the front cover of his first issue. Like, that's very clear what his politics are. And then advertisements for buying war bonds and things like the American colonialism and comic books have always been intertwined. And so there's this mix of, there's great messages in there, and then there's destructive ones. They're all political. And then I will mention, I don't know if you guys have this problem in the United States, people have started wearing the Punisher logo, the skull, as a symbol of authoritarian fascism, of police rule through violence and supremacy.
We do. Here, people started wearing the national soccer team t-shirt,
Yeah. So the creator of the Punisher, one of the two men that created the Punisher, started a campaign to take back the skull because he vehemently disagreed that the Punisher isn't about, it's a misreading of the Punisher, who is himself like a social critique against violence, not for it. And I actually contributed to that project. He had people design different Punisher skulls with new symbols and logos. So I created a Punisher skull with a flower crown on it. I thought was a nice symbol of peace for that particular one. I also you've mentioned Alan Moore, and I also want to speak to, he's changed not just the comic book industry, but mainstream culture in a significant way through his works, whether or not people recognize it. V for Vendetta was an incredible graphic novel when it was written. It was an okay movie that I enjoyed when it came out 20 years after that. And then years after that, it became a symbol of populist uprisings of all kind. And so it became associated with great ideas and bad ideas, but just that a simple image from a graphic novel would end up taking that huge resonance speaks to the power of words and pictures, and how a simple idea can just really take over.
That's amazing. So I think we can wrap up. Does anybody have any other question? No? So I will wrap up, okay? So I'll finish with asking people just to say their final thoughts for the day, and then I'll go back to you, okay? I think Marina wants to say something.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just,
No problem.
I want to ask him about something. Well, we have exchanged so many text messages, but we hadn't seen each other until now. But my English is really bad, so I'm gonna ask in Portuguese and ask for Barbara. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Acho que eu queria fazer um comentário primeiro, porque o Aladdin, ele falou que ele tem muita curiosidade, tinha muita curiosidade de pegar outras versões, né, do Green Sheaf, porque a Pamela coloria um por um, e ele queria saber se ela alterava essas cores, assim. E trabalhando nesse projeto, estou trabalhando com a Elisa está até acompanhando a gente aqui. A Elisa é do Nós Outras Tarô, e ela que fez toda a parte artística da campanha. Então, a gente tem conversado muito sobre a arte da Pamela, né? E ele falou isso e me lembrou porque ao longo de toda a pesquisa, eu encontrei algumas imagens com diferentes cores, né? Então, a gente sempre acaba tendo que optar por uma, e às vezes você perde um pouco porque tem alguma cor que você gosta muito naquela ali, mas a leitura daquela outra tá tão boa, assim. E a gente teve um desses casos em uma das cartas que a Elisa fez, né? Que é a carta da justiça. Essa que a gente imprimiu, aqui está impresso, a gente imprimiu em casa, né? Para ser o protótipo da carta. Mas essa, acabou que não vai ser essa coloração, porque a Elisa a gente, né? Eu, Elisa, o Edu, a gente encontrou duas versões. E uma outra que está mais colorida, mas as cores são diferentes. Então, assim, eu acho muito legal você pegar isso e ver que você tem algumas versões da própria Pamela, né? Então, ver como ela experimentava isso, assim. Eu acho que a Elisa até saberia falar um pouco melhor sobre isso. Eu queria perguntar para ele sobre duas pessoas em específico que ele citou, que eu acho uma das coisas que ele vai trazer para esse livro, que eu acho que é muito rico, são essas outras personalidades que estavam no Green Sheaf, e que, como ele falou, a gente tem tanta dificuldade de encontrar material, saber um pouco mais sobre a vida deles, né? Quando eu peguei o Green Sheaf pela primeira vez, eu achava que Cecil era uma mulher. Assim, Cecil French, me parece um nome tão feminino, assim, e conversando com a Elisa, a gente falando do trabalho dele, ele vai mudando muito ao longo do Green Sheaf, sabe? Parece que o traço vai se aproximando um pouco com o da Pamela, e aí ele vai evoluindo ao longo do Green Sheaf. Eu queria perguntar se ele sabe, se ele tem conhecimento do Cecil ter tido alguma aula ou ter aprendido com a Pamela uma forma melhor de desenhar para impressão, porque o genial da Pamela era isso, né? Ela tinha um conhecimento absurdo do tipo de traço que ficava bom para impressão. E é por isso que as pessoas precisavam tanto dela, muitas vezes, né? Então, eu queria perguntar isso, se ele tem conhecimento dessa relação dos dois?
Primeiro, deixa eu falar. Elisa, se você quiser abrir a câmera, abrir o microfone, eu pedi para o Rodrigo te colocar de co-host também, se você quiser dar um oi para a gente. Ficarei honrada. Now let me try to translate. So first, Marina made a comment about the arts, because you talked about how you're interested in seeing all editions of Green Sheaf, all editions, no, all the magazines, or as many as possible, to compare if she would keep the color scheme or change, or and how it influences or reflects the meaning in the drawing. And then she said that because they are preparing, Elisa and Paula, they are preparing a deck of a major arcana only, and they are using Pamela's arts to illustrate this deck, and it's so extraordinary. I'm really excited. I'm so excited about this deck that I actually ordered two. Because I want to keep one in the collection and I want to use the other, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So she was saying that the Justice card, they found different versions of the same art with different colors. So she was commenting about this.
Great.
And they are like debating a lot of what version to use for the card. And then she asked a question. So she talked about Cecil, which is one of the collaborators of Green Sheaf. Mm-hmm. And she was mentioning how his art changed throughout the magazine history. And it seems like his art became more similar, more closer to Pamela's art. And then she wanted to ask if you know if he has had classes with Pamela, if somehow Pamela influenced his work, because she was very good with doing art for printing and having a high quality printing printed art. And then people would go for her to learn the techniques, and maybe he learned the techniques, and that's how his style kind of was very influenced by hers. So do you know something about it?
So that was something I was curious about. Their artwork does end up looking very similar, and there's a couple stories where they each illustrate one of the pictures and kind of try to match each other in tone and style. I couldn't figure out how Cecil French and Pamela Colman Smith met. Cecil French was an art collector, and I know later in his life he was friends with Shannon and Ricketts, who were a couple of artists. They were a queer couple, friends with Oscar Wilde, and they were much more known. They had their own press. They were very famous in their time. And Cecil French's artwork, I think he published a couple pieces in their magazine that I want to say is called The Dial. There's two magazines of the period called The Dial. Shannon and Ricketts made the one that is far more beautiful and like handmade, part of that kind of archaic aesthetic. And his art early in his career was compared to them unfavorably. People would refer to him as kind of a lesser Shannon and Ricketts. And around 1903, 1904, when the Green Sheaf came out, was when he decided to give up painting. He'd been studying at the Royal Academy of Art, and he felt that he could never live up to his masters. And so he stopped painting, he continued doing woodcuts, and he made this work with Pamela Colman Smith, which, if I had to guess, and I've spent plenty of time thinking about it, I think that he saw Pamela Colman Smith's style, brought something of his old woodcuts from his previous work, and did his best to imitate what she was doing. And he's good at that. He is an excellent artist. I wish he'd kept going, because you do not have to be as good as the very best artist in England in order to justify making your art. But he was friends with all these masters, and he collected a huge volume of paintings. And so he's best known today for having donated hundreds of artworks to public institutions, libraries, British Museum, and so his collection composes some of the best symbolist painters of the time, realist symbolist painters that were having showings at the Royal Academy of Art and similar institutions. It was a mix of his appreciation of that, the like pre-Raphaelite artwork, arts and crafts movement, and then his interest developed. He was also a theosophist, and he had an extensive essay published on occult artwork and spirituality in artwork, where he describes his ideas about symbolism and what he hopes the next generation of artists will achieve. He's not one of them, but he hopes and speaks to the younger folks that he hopes to inspire. So I think he got a lot from Pamela Coleman Smith. I think that she got some from him. I don't know what kind of time they actually spent together in person. I suspect that all of the coloring for his work is more or less designed by Pamela Coleman Smith. I think that as a colorist, I don't know for sure, but that once she got black and white artwork, she chose what to color and how to color it. In addition to, she had a school for coloring. And so presumably she had students and other assistants that were helping out. It was something in her previous periodical she'd worked on, a broadsheet, Jack Butler Yeats had criticized her for not coloring fast enough, and she's always too busy to do the coloring for our magazine. So that tension was probably still there a little bit in the Green Sheaf, although it was actually her project. So the sense of ownership, I think she was, probably was a little bit more excited at the very least to do the coloring for those pages.
Great, thank you. So, Ulisses, final comments for the day, and what is Enochiano.com?
Say that again?
It's Enochian magic, so it's in Portuguese Enochiano.
Okay. Enochian magic comes from John Dee. He is as I am a big fan. He was operating in London around the 1583
he's
period.
A big fan. Okay.
Yeah, big fan. So he had a bunch. He spoke to a lot of angel spirits, ghosts, not directly. He always had scryers. So he preferred children. He'd use his own children. He'd hire beggars from the streets. He also used a lot of actors and other poets, dreamers, people that seemed like they were more in touch with the spirits, so that he could then have a seance. He recorded all of his seances in a secret book that was never intended to be seen by the public, because he was also, he was a friend of the Queen and the Queen's spy master, Francis Walsingham. He had an international reputation. And so Enochian magic is something he got from one of his scryers, Edward Kelly. The two of them wrote down what they believed to be the angels retelling the Book of Enoch, which is a 2nd century book. It was Jewish and Enochian Christians, or I forget the exact sect. There's an Ethiopian sect that believes in the Book of Enoch, which it was a lost book at the time John Dee was writing. So when he wrote his own version of the Book of Enoch, it was based loosely on what he'd heard of this old book, and also involved a bunch of magical operations from the angels with clues on how to essentially decode their language and use it to conjure powers. So the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn loved John Dee also. They did a bunch of operations.
Are you a practitioner?
I am an extensive researcher. I'm involved in a John Dee conspiracy that I was wondering if it would come up. I won't speak too much about it, but there is an ancient ruin here in the United States, in New England, that it's called the Newport Tower. And I visited the Newport Tower Museum, where one man and no one else believes it was built by John Dee, or designed by John Dee and built by a company that he had sent in 1583. That little piece of land was a colony that John Dee had arranged for. He had the deeds for it. It was the Humphrey Gilbert mission that failed. So they made it to Canada, but they never made it to the settlement. John Dee did have 2 ships sent 9 months prior that arrived. They were there for about a year working. No one knows what they were doing. And then they went back. So the theory is that he had the tower built for the settlers when they arrived, but the settlers never arrived. It fell into disrepair. And then the colonists, when they eventually found it, the governor of New England claimed it as his windmill, even though it was never, there's no records of it ever operating as a windmill. There's no artifacts remaining that show it was a windmill. It was a tower that if he had been honest when he found it, there would have been a legal claim to the land from the D family that was still in existence. So I think he very intentionally, if he knew what it was or knew that it was of English origin, kept it a secret because he found the land first and claimed it for himself.
Oh my God, I didn't know anything of this.
This is another one of my research projects. I wrote an article on this a few years ago have the volume, American Eldritch #2. You can find this on Amazon.
So do you see this guy who is here with us, Ulysses? He's a specialist in Enochian magic.
Oh, right.
And he's writing a massive book, like a comprehensive guide on it. And it's like big already, like 400 pages long and growing. So,
so many people have taken that system and elaborated. Like John Dee believed in everything that he was doing to the extent where whatever you can take from it, it's coming from a place of true sincerity. And then the Edward Kelly element, I've seen there are so many people that feel very strongly that he was like a liar and a con man, and people that feel very strongly that he had the visual insight and power. And reading John Dee's journals as he navigates that too, because he goes between, and at some point, Edward Kelly tells John Dee, hey, none of this is real. Like I'm making this up and I'm tired and we gotta stop. And John Dee writes down, Edward Kelly's lost the spirit, I have to encourage him. Like he thinks this is all lies. He thinks he's making it up, and I have to remind him that this is real. And so it's interesting to watch the two of them with these tensions. And so, yeah, my interest in Enochian magic really comes from John Dee and my research there, which also goes back to the Lovecraft connection. Lovecraft credited John Dee as the original author or translator of his magical book, the Necronomicon. And so there's lore in there that connects with the New England setting. H.P. Lovecraft visited that tower and wrote about that tower, and it inspired stories. And he never knew about the John Dee connection because the deed to the colony wasn't found until 1935 in the Elizabethan State Papers. Nobody knew that there was a colony in New England. Or where it was, this supposed thing, which there wasn't a colony. There were just the deeds and legal stuff. But if you want John Dee history, the guy who runs the Newport Tower will talk even more than me about John Dee. He'll go on for hours. He's an incredible resource. He's a bit of a polymath and has a really comprehensive knowledge of John Dee. He recommended a bunch of books to me, and I have a.
What is his name again?
His name is Jim Egan, Jim Egan. He runs, I think the Newport Tower Museum.com has a lot of his theories and writings and lays out the basic groundwork of his theory, which I have to stress again, no one else, there are no historical societies or folklore societies or anyone else that seems to be in agreement with him. But after talking to him, none of them would agree to hear him out. So I listened, I heard his whole story. It was very engaging and completely plausible. And I researched as much as I could to be like, well, can I disprove any of the stuff he's saying or the ideas that he has? And I can't. It's still the mystery of we don't know what really happened, but his theories are, as far as I'm concerned, the leading rational explanation for how that very strange tower appeared out of nowhere with no historical building records or anything like that associated.
Well, what I can say, you're so passionate about it that you're making me passionate about it. Now I want to.
I know we tried to wrap this call up a while ago, and then you got me going on John Dee, and that's a whole nother episode right there.
Okay, so does anybody have any other questions? No.
Be careful, because I'll answer them.
So let's wrap up. So final words for the night, Ulysses. Did you know about this conspiracy thing?
I heard about, but not with some details. But it's very nice to know about that. I will try to find about the Jim Egan I don't know this guy.
You can tell him Aladdin sent you. He'll remember me.
But it was a fantastic interview. This part of it, this end, for me, it's amazing because I love the many new informations. Thank you, Aladdin.
Absolutely.
It's a pleasure to be here with you to talk about the Pamela and now about the John G. Thank you.
Vanessa, e o que é o Conexão Pagã?
Em português. O Conexão Pagã é um canal onde eu falo semanalmente com o André Correia, e a gente fala sobre assuntos de paganismo, bruxaria e assuntos afim. Aladdin, thank you so much. It was a delight to hear you tonight. Thank you so much. It was amazing.
Absolutely.
Marina, fala da campanha da oficina Palimpsestos e seus comentários finais.
Então, a campanha está no ar. Para quem tiver interesse, é catarse.me/Pamela. A gente está em 80%, mas nós temos também as metas estendidas. Então, assim, a gente não quer chegar ao 100%, a gente quer ir além.
A gente quer chegar em 170%.
Em 370%.
Para ter o Green Sheaf em português.
Exatamente. O Green Sheaf é uma das metas estendidas. Então, para a gente ter esse livro não, né? Todas as revistas da Pamela, a gente precisa chegar lá e ter esse material todo traduzido no Brasil, né? Então, por favor, gente, apoia lá, faz esse projeto incrível acontecer. Como vocês puderam ver um pouquinho, vai ter esse ensaio maravilhoso do Aladdin, que eu tô louca para ler. Então, assim, eu insisti, eu estava pronta para insistir muito com ele, porque eu achei que ele não fosse topar. E fiquei muito feliz quando ele topou. E eu acho que é uma parte importante, porque todo mundo que fala sobre a Pamela, geralmente fala com muito cuidado, e é um cuidado que às vezes me incomoda um pouco, assim, quando vão falar sobre a questão queer. Por quê? Geralmente fala assim, o que nós temos comprovado historicamente é que a Pamela não se casou e não teve filhos. Ela andava com muitas mulheres, tinha relação com muitas mulheres, mas não se pode provar que ela era lésbica. As pessoas parecem que têm muito medo disso, assim. E o que eu quis, a gente quis complementar essa parte histórica, assim, porque eu acho importante, eu acho de uma representatividade, eu acho que a gente precisa ter em mente que naquela época ela não seria abertamente lésbica, sabe? Não teriam, muitas formas de provar aquilo. Então, assim, cartas em que ela abertamente falava sobre outras mulheres. Não é assim que as coisas funcionam, né? Ela poderia ter sido presa naquela época. Ela, como o próprio Aladdin citou, assim, existiram casos muito pesados pouco tempo antes, né, da época dela, que foram muito marcantes e muito traumatizantes para toda essa comunidade. Então, eu acho que se existem pessoas reclamando essa legitimação da sexualidade da Pamela, eu acho que a gente tem que ouvir, a gente tem que repensar, a gente tem que trazer isso à tona, sim, porque não é um traço de vergonha, sabe? A gente não tem que ter medo de falar sobre isso. Se, para mim, ao menos, parece tão claro que essa era a vida dela. A gente admira essa mulher como um todo, por tudo que ela fez e quem ela era. Então, acho que o trabalho do Aladdin é muito importante para a gente poder perceber isso. E nós temos outro ensaio também que toca nessa questão, que é o da Elisa Riemer e da Paula Maria Riemer, que também vão falar sobre a relação da Pamela com outras mulheres. Então é isso, gente. Essa campanha está incrível, está maravilhosa, e é a primeira vez que a gente vai ter no Brasil algo sobre a Pamela. Então, apoiem e ajudem a gente a transformar isso numa realidade. Queria agradecer a vocês, muito obrigada. E thank you, Aladdin, you are amazing. I love you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate y'all reaching out.
E Rodrigo, o que é o Projeto Mayhem?
Thank you, Aladdin. O Projeto Mayhem é isso aqui, essas entrevistas. Você entra no catarse.me/TDC, você se cadastra para participar e você vai receber uma revista maravilhosa como essa aqui, onde você vai ter diversos artigos de diversos assuntos. Deixa eu ver se eu estou acertando. Para você ler em casa. Mas esses artigos todos estão no site. Além disso, você vai ter grupos do Telegram, onde você vai poder participar de diversos assuntos e desfrutar de todo esse conhecimento.
All right, so I'll just tell you what people said, so you know a little bit who is here. So as Marina, you already know, so Vanessa has also a YouTube channel about paganism, and it's very interesting. Ulysses, as I said, is a specialist in Enochian magic, and he has the biggest group of Enochian magic online in Brazil. And Rodrigo is representing Project Mayhem, which is this podcast. And Project Mayhem is also very big. We have lots of different groups about the specific topics in occultism, like Kabbalah and the Wheel of the Year and all kinds of things. And we also produce the magazine, which has all articles that are published in the magazine are actually available for free online, but we are old school people who enjoy paper. And for my final words, thank you. Oh my God, you are amazing. You are great. I was so delighted this evening. I was very nervous because it was my first time as the host, but I believe everything was fine. And I hope you feel you have felt welcomed, because we are all like the sparkle in your eye really speaks to me, you know, and it's so brilliant. Thank you for being such a young person already having an extraordinary work. It's your work is very important for us. Keep doing it, and you're welcome back whenever you want to. It was very nice to have you. Thank you. And today I have to say I am representing Ecclesia Babylon. Fazer meu jabá também. So Ecclesia Babylon is a Thelemic agnostic religious institution with Babylon as our central goddess. So if you're interested in Thelema and having this very open, very progressive group of Thelemites who kind of think outside the box and welcome everybody and try to be as healthy as possible, join us. We have online rights and also in-person rights in some states of Brazil. So if you're interested, you can join, you can enter our website, fourgatesanctuary.com. It's 4G sanctuary.com, or you can talk to me on Instagram. It's at vesa.nox. I love to interact with everyone. So that's it. Thank you, Aladdin. And now tell us how we can find you, your amazing work, comic work, your books, everything.
Yeah, I don't keep too much of an online presence in any one place. I kind of jump around. Aladdin.tumblr.com is a place you can find me sometimes. I have a YouTube channel that I post essays and comedy videos onto called I Love Lamp. And Instagram, you can find me, username at AL666IN. if you want to follow me for my various stories when I'm posting about my life here in Baltimore. Thanks so much for having me. You were an excellent host. I will be sure to check out more of these projects. Having the opportunity to talk to people who are interested in this stuff and not just humoring me is amazing. Loved it. My friends will, they'll listen to me talk about this stuff for a while, but not for an hour. So this was an incredible opportunity. I loved it. And I hope you guys have an excellent night. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Pode encerrar, Rodrigo.